Okay, well, it's about that time. We've given our couple of friends who are not with us today a few minutes to jump on. And since I don't have anything in my inbox, we're going to go ahead and get started. And as they join us, we'll catch them up and engage them in the conversation. I'm going to turn my video on just for a minute. Um, Maybe not. Will, can you just turn on my video just for a second? Is that possible? That way you can just see me and I can say hi to you all as we get started. I'm super excited that you all are here, and I appreciate the questions that you're already putting in the question and answer box. We will get those today, I promise. As I mentioned earlier, this is the actual first Trusted Confianza training, and so I'm super excited. And today we're going to be just doing the first module. It's important to know that this training consists of 3 modules. So you can do it, as you've discovered, in 3 pieces throughout. You can take as much time as you want to finish it, or you can take as little time as you want to finish it. We're also offering on a Saturday a month the entire training, all 3 modules together. So we're giving people in our congregations and in our communities a lot of choice as they try to decide the best way. So I appreciate you all coming, and I look forward to seeing you today for Module 1, but in the future for Module 2 and Module 3 as well. So I see some great questions in the question box, and I'm going to get to those in a minute. Okay, so for some reason my video is not working, so I just picture me sitting in my office waving to you. I want to say thank you for giving up your time today. I know our time is valuable, and so I want to honor that as we move through. This is important work, and I am so very grateful for your commitment to this important ministry, so thank you. As we begin, I invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Lord, as we gather together to do your work, we pray that your light will surround us, your love will enfold us, your power will protect us, and your presence will watch over us. May we seek to be faithful servants who create safe places for all of your children to feel your love, your power, and your presence. May we never grow complacent, tired, or weary. May we work tirelessly for the safety of those whom you have put in our care, so that wherever we are and whomever we are with, all will feel safe and trust in your faithful presence and love. It's in your holy name that we pray. Amen. So as we get started, I know that I recognize the names on the screen today, but it's always good just to hear where everybody's from. So and this will give you a chance to practice using some of the tools we have available. So if you can find your chat box, you can go ahead and chat in the chat box and share where you are from. So if you want to share maybe city or district or church, whatever you think would be helpful to others as we gather today. And as you chat, I will see your answers and I will share them with the community. So I'll give everybody just a quick second to find those tools if you have them available to you. We've got Kelly Duke from Sierra Vista in San Angelo. We were just at camp together. I guess, was that last week? Gosh, that was super fun. We'll see. We've got Susanna Frey. Hey, Sue, it's good to have you with us, who's here in San Antonio, and she's the new Christian educator at Laurel Heights United Methodist Church, where my husband and I actually worship. So good to have you with us. And then we also have Leanne Clemens on with us. And Leanne, I cannot remember where you where you're from, where you work. My brain is not remembering. So if you get a chance to share that information, let us know. Next, I'm curious to hear what your role is in ministry. I think I know this already, but I want to make sure that I use your words to describe your job. So go ahead and find that chat box again and share how you would describe your role in ministry. Maybe that's a job title or focus of your volunteer ministry. And we'll give everybody a second to fill that out. We've got Sue, who's the director of Christian Ed, and she's still figuring out what that looks like at Laurel Heights. And I totally get that. I'm sure many of us who've been doing this for a long time know what it's like to step into a new context and a new congregation. Kelly Duke is the Director of Children and Family Ministries at Sierra Vista. And we'll see, Leanne, for some reason, if you're using the chat box, I'm not getting your chats, but you can also use the Q&A box if you want to throw it up in there too, so we can learn a little bit about you as well. Oops, we're going to go back one. That question was just simply, have you completed the Safe Gatherings training online? That'll give me an idea of where we're starting today. So Will, I think we have a poll to throw up there for that one.
Sorry, I got into something else. So this one, have you completed the Safe Gathering online training? Is that the one?
Yes, please.
All right, there we go. It's launching now.
Awesome, thank you. So this will give us a chance to practice the poll tool for the webinars that we'll be using over the next 3 modules. These polls serve several purposes. One, just to get your feedback. 2, to hear kind of what you're thinking as we move through the material. But 3rd is just to honestly to check and make sure that you're engaged and you're paying attention. That's one of the reasons we wanted to have this online interactive training, is so that we would have a chance to actually engage with one another and learn from one another. And so the way we know if someone's actually participating in the training is by asking them to participate. So here's your first poll. So have you completed the Safe Gathering online training? And you can go ahead and click on your answer. Maybe you've completed 100% of it, maybe you've completed none of it, or maybe you've completed a portion of it. And while you do that, we got an answer from Leanne, so thank you. She's from McAllen, First United Methodist Church in the El Valle district, and she's the Children's and Discipleship Ministries staff person. And so thank you, Leanne, for that. So I guess that means you work with Veronica Dillon, which she's fantastic. I do a lot of youth ministry work with Veronica. Yes, exclamation point. And then we have that at least one of you has finished the training. And here we go. All 3 of you finished it. Fantastic. So we should be able to move through this pretty quickly as we just engage in conversation, look at what this might look like in your context, and start answering some questions. So the objective, some people have asked me about, what is this Trusted con Confianza training all about? Like, why do we have this and Safe Gatherings? And the reason really is, like I've said, is the accountability piece. I don't know about you, but whenever I've been asked to take defensive driving online, I often get distracted. I find other things to do. I move through it very quickly, and I don't have time, or I don't sometimes, admittedly, don't take the time to process everything I've learned and to try to ask the question of, what does this mean for me and what does this look like? When the Safety Task Force was designing this certification program, we as educators realized that the most important part of this work in creating safe places is the reflection and the discernment and the sharing of best practices. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a forum for persons to connect. Because what often happens when I do trainings, and some of you may have participated in Safe Sanctuary trainings, or you may have led them yourself. One of the things I find is, it's not the material that's the problem, it's trying to figure out how do we implement it. And a lot of times I just get like really big eyes, like deer in the headlights. And so what often happens is people are like, I just can't do this. Like, they completely shut down. Or they just say, well, I'm just gonna find my way, or I'll deal with it later. So this training is really meant for us to say, okay, we have all this information. Now, what questions do we have? What does this look like in our context? And how do we do this work? So as we move through, we have several objectives with this training. First, to increase awareness, to develop theological responsibility, to outline expectations, to equip leaders, and to provide resources. Those are our main goals with this whole certification program. And then to identify next steps. So as we move through these modules, hopefully you'll leave with next steps that you want to take to help your congregations do this work. So our work today specifically is module 1. We're going to talk about our calling. We're going to talk about why we do this work, and we're going to talk about what that might look like in our context. And the reason for this is we're finding that the hard part of this new safety process is that it's just not in many of our cultures to do this work. I know several of you, and so I know several of you have been doing this for a long time, but overall in our conference, we are asking people to make a culture shift when we are asking them to have a policy and live into the policy. And so one of the ways you help, as y'all probably know, persons in your congregation to come alongside you in this work is to know why we're doing it and to share the why. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. And we're going to do this through conversation using the chat box and the Q&A box. We're going to look at some specific scenarios that might come up, either some that you lift up in the question and answer box or some that I've brought to the table. And then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So the objectives for today is to understand why we have our policy and to know our responsibility. So let's begin. I'm going to show a quick video, probably of a scripture you've seen or heard before. But what I want you to invite you to do is just find a piece of paper. And as you're watching and listening, I have two questions for you to pay attention to. What captures your attention? And what is this passage inviting you to do? What captures your attention and what is this passage inviting you to do? Here we go. And I am not getting any sound. Wait, that may be my fault. That's my fault.
The boy Jesus lingered behind.
There we go.
His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. When they finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. Joseph and his mother did not know it, but supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. So when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. Now so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So when they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said to him,
"Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have sought you anxiously."
And he said to them,
"Why do you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?"
But they did not understand the statement which he spoke to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them, but his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men.
Not sure what the technical difficulty is there. Tanya, if you are talking, your audio is not on.
Thank you, Will. So I guess when I'm learning, friends, thank you for your patience. I guess when I turn on the video, it turns off my voice. That's good to know. So sorry. So for those of you waiting patiently for me to give you instructions, if you will use the chat box to share what captured your attention with this text. Or if you would like, you can use the chat box to share what is this passage inviting you to do. This gives us an opportunity to hear from one another as we wrestle with this text and set the context for our work together. I know for me, whenever I hear and listen to this text, I know that I hear it differently depending on who I'm sitting with and where I'm sitting and what's going on in my life. Leanne shares that she's captured by Jesus's calmness. Yes, absolutely. That I could see that for sure. Other thoughts? Sue mentioned that this passage seems to be inviting her to learn more about God. Yeah, Jesus's curiosity definitely pulls us in. And so then go ahead and share what this passage might be calling you to do next. Did you hear God speaking to you to do something out of this text? And while you do that, I want to welcome Annette. Thank you for joining us, Annette. We're just taking some time to reflect on the scripture we just saw and heard, the story of Jesus in the temple. And so we're reflecting on that in the chat box. So we're glad that you're here. In this story, we definitely hear about Jesus. We hear about his family, and we hear about many others traveling to Jerusalem as it was their custom, their ritual, their family tradition. We also see Jesus sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Whenever I listen to this text and I hear it, I always think this must have been a safe place for Jesus, a place where he felt welcomed, where he could grow in God's love and grace. I don't know about you, but when I work with children, it's very clear that children and youth often will only sit with persons that they trust. If they don't feel valued, if they don't feel respected, they're often going to find something else to do. And so I think that it says something that Jesus was able to sit with these people, that it was a safe place and a safe community. But John 10, 11 through 13 reminds us that the world is not always a safe place. We hear Jesus say, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. When the hired hand sees the wolf coming, he leaves the sheep and runs away. That's because he isn't the shepherd. The sheep aren't really his. So the wolf attacks the sheep and scatters them. He's only a hired hand, and the sheep don't matter to him." Unfortunately, we know that there are wolves in this world, and there are hired hands who do not care for the sheep. And so I just want to ask you to take a minute for silent reflection. When have you witnessed someone being left in an unsafe situation? What were the implications or the consequences of that person being left in that unsafe place? Is there anything that could have been done to keep the person safe? In ministry, we unfortunately hear many stories of allegations and crimes committed in places that are thought to be safe. I know I can share many stories, and I'm sure you have some of your own. And so as we move through this module and the others that will follow, and as we do the holy work of living into a safety policy together, I want to invite you to think, always with eyes open, to think about what am I doing to create a safe place? And is there anything I could do to create a safe place? As you learned in the Safe Gatherings training, and as you hear statistics, we are reminded that abuse in our ministry settings establishes a call for us to do all we can to protect those in our care. And so just looking at the why, people always ask me, how do I share this with my congregation? How do I invite them to do this work? And so looking at the why, we are reminded of our sacrament of baptism, where we commit to doing all that we can to ensure that the person being baptized, child, youth, or adult, can grow in a way that they are confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads to life eternal. This is also affirmed in our doctrine and in the Book of Discipline, where we read the mandate that we have policies and procedures in place to ensure that all children and all the adults who care for them work and their work is safe. And so reasons why we have this policy is to protect vulnerable persons, to protect ministry leaders, to create a safe place for ministry, to reduce the liability of the church. Those are all really good reasons as to why we do this work. I'm going to go ahead and skip us to the next portion and ask this question, and you can use the chat box to answer. Who is responsible for the safety of the vulnerable in your church and ministry area? Your answer to this question might differ depending on where you are and who you work with. Someone answered, probably me. Absolutely. Each of us, especially as you become certified and become Trusted con Confianza certified, you become an advocate for all vulnerable persons in your context, keeping eyes open to and always asking the question, is this safe? Are we doing all we can to ensure that these persons are safe? Someone else mentioned that every adult present during ministry. Absolutely. The dream and hope and call of the Safety Task Force is that we will see a day where all persons in every church and every ministry context are aware of the need to have best practices in place to ensure the safety, and that they are all aware of what those best practices are. So it is our dream that all persons, all adults present during ministry will live responsibly, ensuring the safety of the vulnerable in their areas. Someone else mentioned there's oftentimes a protocol for background checks, but otherwise it's likely my responsibility. Absolutely. As ministry leaders, I think we all, Annette, I'm not sure if you want to share in the chat box what your role is, if you're staff or volunteer, and what your area ministry is. For many of us, we are leaders in the church. And so at the end of the day, it does come back to us to make sure our volunteers are background checked and screened and trained, and to make sure that even if they're trained, that we all are doing all we can to live the way that we learn to live in our training. We know sometimes it's easy just to go with what's easy. And so continuing to be intentional and always asking, and a lot of times that does fall on staff people, staff persons, especially those of us who are charged with the care of the vulnerable in our ministry. So let's take a minute and look specifically at safety policy components, and I'll be answering some of your questions as we move through. Will, I'm not remembering, what is my next poll that I have? Because I think it's here.
Your next poll is why do we have a policy?
Yes, please, and thank you.
You ready for that to go up?
I'm ready for it to go up. Thank you. So friends, now you can see that there is another poll before you. So I invite everyone to participate in the poll where it asks, why do we have a policy? And you can click, you can only click one. So we'll see what answers we receive, and we'll have some conversation about that. And we'll see what questions come up out of this poll. Because I know the Safe Gatherings training, we worked with them to make sure there's some pieces in there that point to our policy, but we want to be real specific and clear. Fantastic, you all get an A, 100%. So we have a policy to protect the vulnerable in our areas, to protect our volunteers, to create a safe place for ministry to happen, and to reduce the liability of our church. Fantastic, thank you. And now, Will, if you'll go ahead and post the next one, which should be who are identified as vulnerable. There it is. Gonna get skills at the poll. So if you'll go ahead and answer this poll, who are identified as vulnerable according to Safe Gatherings and the Rio Texas Conference policy? You've got in front of you children, youth, elders, persons with special needs, persons requiring the care of another adult for health and well-being. give you just 30 more seconds to, there it goes, to fill that out, and we'll see how you all did. All of you got 100%. See, these aren't hard. Again, these are just to engage in conversation, to make sure you're remembering what you learned at Safe Gatherings, and to also check on your participation, if I'm being completely honest. So thank you for participating. So yes, we of course know that vulnerable persons include children and youth, which in the state of Texas, this is any person under 18. Texas law actually identifies any person under 18 as a child. We typically talk about them as children and youth. Includes elders, persons with special needs, and mostly as we get to talking about our adults, it refers to persons requiring the care of another adult for health and for well-being. So let's talk about some best practices that you might remember being in our policy, or some best practices that you do in your church or in your ministry context. We know that our work is to create safe ministry using best practices as identified by legal experts, insurance mandates, as well as denominational and industry standards. So what are some of these practices that you know are in the policy, or others that you use in your church? And while you think about some of those best practices and put them in the chat box, we just heard from Annette, who let us know that she's staff. She's the secretary and also serves as at the church as the vice chair of the council, treasurer, and membership chair. Woo! That's a lot of ministry right there, Annette. We're glad that you're with us, and thank you for sharing. So I'm going to try to get up the whiteboard. So you're going to see my slides disappear. And I'm going to write down on the whiteboard what persons are saying. And then we can identify which of these are actually in the policy and what are other best practices. So one person wrote the 3-person rule, which of course is that you have 2 unrelated adults at all times with vulnerable persons, children, youth, or adults. And knowing that our policy states above and beyond that, that's for the first 8 people, that you have 2 unrelated adults. And then after that, you're just going to add an adult for every 8. You can go ahead and use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you might have or challenges you might have as you think about the 3-person rule. Someone chatted back, and this is a good definition of the 3-person rule: always have 2 adults with a group of children, and always have windows in classrooms. That's a really great best practice, is to have windows in classrooms and or to have doors open. And I'm going to put that in orange because while we don't specifically lay that out in our conference policy, this is something that you might choose to add to your church policy. It's always a really good practice to be able to see in, to know what's going on. Somebody lifted up the 5-year age gap between servant team members and oldest child in program. Absolutely, and I'm going to put that in blue because that is part of our conference policy, 5-year-old age gap. So whoever the oldest child or youth is in the program, if they are a participant in the ministry that you have created and that you are overseeing, then they are a vulnerable person. And so the supervising adults or the certified adults must be 5 years older. Someone else added a clear social media policy for not friending kids or not posting pics of kids, etc. Absolutely. So social media policy. And what the conference policy specifically says about this is that if you have a group that you create, that your church creates for vulnerable persons, so say you have a youth group and you create a Facebook page for your youth group, that needs to be moderated by 2 or more trained adults, unrelated, 5 years older. So that you have two people who are trained in this watching that group at all times, just in case something happens on the page, people can respond quickly. It's also helpful to keep incorrect information from being shared. You know, somebody says, are we supposed to be there at 6 tonight? And somebody's like, no, I think 6:30. You know, having two adults on there who know the information can just spit back correct information and clear up any confusion. So it's always good to have two adults on that. Also having a photo policy where your church decides how you're going to use pictures of vulnerable persons, and having a photo release form where you get permission to share those pictures and to use those pictures in that way. And again, if you have any questions about these practices as we go over them, feel free to put those questions in the question box. There's a lot of questions about background checks and safe gatherings that I'm going to get to at the end. So if you have questions about what this looks like in your context. It's important to know too that our policy talks about driving, that some best practices that are lifted up in our policy are that drivers need to be 21 years or older. That is a insurance thing, that they have to have a valid driver's license, that they have to be insured, that they have to have a clear driving record. And if the ministry organizes and provides transportation, then 2 adults is recommended. And I can say more about that if there's questions, but I always say it this way. If the ministry, if your church organizes and provides transportation, then the safety policy goes into play. Somebody just posted parental consent for transportation off church campus. Absolutely. If you're organizing a ministry event that includes transportation and you are providing that transportation, you must have parental consent when you leave the building. You also have to have permission in a medical release form if you're going somewhere overnight. Okay, fantastic. So the next question, I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to put back my PowerPoint. And so now one of the things that we know too, that it's not just about our best practices, but it's about creating safe boundaries. And we're going to talk more about boundaries and balance of power in module 2. But for today, I want you to think about what boundaries our policies create. Things that say it's different here. When you come to this space, adults do not manipulate, threaten, or abuse. Persons can be trusted, and things that say you are safe here. So what are some, as you think about this, what are some boundaries that our policy sets or that we can set in the church that help tell persons you are safe here? I'm going to put that whiteboard back up. Try to get a clean, maybe get a clean slate. Oh, okay, I'll clear it off. There we go. Someone just put background check for all volunteers. I may have missed that earlier, but that is a good practice and it's required by the policy, and it's good to set, it's a good boundary to set too, to be able to tell families, we background check all of our volunteers. All of our volunteers are screened and trained. That's a clear narrative that we can share with people to say, we're safe here. We screen people, we train people, we take this seriously. It's something that can go on a pamphlet that you hand out. So what are some other boundaries? Let's think about, as y'all put in the chat box, windows and doors, absolutely. If we think about overnight trips, we think about clear boundaries or same gender participants as leaders in the cabins. Another great one that somebody just shared, I'm going to put it in orange because it's not in our policy, but it's something that you could add to your church policy, which is parents sign in and sign out. Another great one that somebody just shared that's not specifically in our policy, but is really important and that you might want to include in your trainings of volunteers and maybe in your church policy is monitoring volunteer behavior and transitioning volunteers to other roles if their leadership borders on bullying or if their leadership is inappropriate. So monitoring behavior of, I'm just going to say ministry leaders because I think this can be staff and volunteers sometimes, unfortunately. Some other things to create these safe boundaries. is remembering with overnight, making sure that there's space between all of the beds. I know I love my personal space. I really don't like people in my personal bubble. And I have some friends that, I'll go on retreats with or camps with, and they just want to sit next to me and watch a movie all night long. And I have a hard time saying, okay, can you please like go to your own space? Because I really want to go to sleep now. So we want to honor people's spaces. And so that's why our policy says, make sure that there's space between sleeping spaces and that everybody has their own place to sleep. So I'm going to put that up here. Oops, I'm going to put it in blue though. And our policy says 3 feet apart, but what this is this is horizontal space. Some people worry about like if there's enough space between the headboards. We're talking more like if you spread your arms out, that you have enough space to spread your arms out and not necessarily get into somebody else's personal space. So we're talking horizontal space. Some other boundaries, identifying adults who are safe, gathered, trained, absolutely. And we are going to be doing that with this new safe gathering system. Every church will have a database of all persons in their church who are certified. And then I will have an entire database of everyone in our conference who is certified. And so that way we can share that information. So fantastic. These are all really great boundaries. And we've talked about some others with the moderated social media groups and the signed release forms. And again, as we go through these, if this is new or if you have questions or if it's not working in your church, go ahead and feel free to post those in the question box. And then finally, our work, and one of the reasons why we have a policy, is to create a safe place that persons can trust. I had somebody say this very clearly in a training I did a couple weeks ago, and this person said, oftentimes when we talk about safety, we hear, I can't do this, or how can I do this? And you hear people talk about like trying to find the easiest solution. And instead, what we're trying to do now is not to say what is going to be easiest, but instead to start asking the question, what solution produces the most trust? What solution produces the most trust? And on that note, we had somebody just add that it's important that we're not just safe gatherings trained, but that other staff or volunteers in your church might need to be CPR or first aid trained. And that's a great thing for churches to ask. We don't say anything specifically about that in the conference policy, but I highly encourage churches, as you look at your new policy, to ask who in our church is CPR and first aid trained, who needs to be trained in CPR and first aid. And nursery workers are a great start. So if you have questions about that as you look at your church policy and want to say, okay, we know we have to do what's in the conference policy, but what can we add to our policy that really ensures that we're doing everything we can to create a safe space? And I'm always happy to help with that. So let me know. So in creating a safe place and building an environment of trust, I'm going to put my PowerPoint back up here. I invite you to think now about the question of how do we create an environment of trust? What are some things that we can do to create an environment of trust? And while you share your answers, I'm going to talk a little bit about the things in the policy that help us do this work, and then answer some of your questions, because some of your questions come up in this part. One of the things that we do to create an environment of trust is we have biannual screening. Every 2 years, all persons who work with the vulnerable will go through this training. Now, I do have good news for you, because people have asked this question. In 2 years, you've done all of this work. You've done the Safe Gatherings training. You've come to the Rio, Texas online training. Do we have to do all of that again? And the short answer is yes and no. So you'll have to do the training again in 2 years, but we're going to make it different. So for those of you who've already been certified, it'll be more of like a recertification. So it'll take less time and it'll just be remembering all of these things that you know and asking how have we been living into our policy, and where are places that we can tweak our tweak our ministry to make sure that we're being faithful. So just know that when I say that there's biannual screening, it will shift and change every 2 years. So you're not doing the exact same training every time. And so that screening and training includes background checks. And so there are a couple questions about background checks. Somebody asked, will we use this process as the new background check instead of the previous form? And the short answer is yes. So once persons are ready to move into the certification process, Safe Gatherings will now become your background check system. So persons will go online like you did and fill out all of that. So you will no longer need a paper form, which I know makes a lot of people really happy because their confidential information isn't just flying around the church somewhere. So that's one great question on the background check, that yes, once you begin using the Safe Gathering system, this replaces any previous background check processes, forms for persons who are being screened for ministry with the vulnerable. Another person asked, what does the online background check cover? Is it a full criminal background check? That's a really great question. And a lot of people will ask you if you're asking volunteers to go through this process. There are 3 pieces to our background check. I would not say that it's not a full criminal background check. It's not something like what the FBI would do or what the CIA would do. But we have 3 databases that we check, and we highly recommend all 3. The first is the National Criminal Database. And what those are looking for are for felony offenses, convicted persons who have been convicted of crime. So if people ask you, what is it going to show? It will not show driving stuff unless you run a driver's check. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So National Criminal Database. The background check also covers a 7-year county of residence check. So it'll check that person's county of residence for 7 years to make sure there's nothing on them there. And then of course it checks the national and state sex registry. So those are the pieces of the criminal background check that is run. For all persons who are actually driving as part of their ministry, that requires a driving record check, and that's simply just a driver's record check. What this does not include, when people ask, this does not include a credit check. This does not include an employment check. So if people are worried about that, we're not looking at any of that stuff. We're not running their credit. So those are the questions on the background checks. Some of you have listed some fun things and the important things in the chat box. So in creating an environment of trust, it's important to be transparent with parents. Absolutely. And tell parents about the trainings. Yes. Let them know that we are doing this work. That really builds that trust. Somebody else said communicating safety policy to parents. Absolutely. And then having volunteer training that goes over specific church policy. Absolutely. And just remember, this is required. You're going to do this work with the Rio, Texas Conference every 2 years, but every year you should have some sort of volunteer training that speaks to your specific church policy. So again, that's a lot of information. I know a lot of you know a lot of this, but if you do have questions or if there's places where you're struggling in your context, go ahead and feel free to ask more questions. So we've talked about the biannual screening and certification, and the reminder that every year your church should have some type of volunteer training that goes over your policy and does abuse training. And there's lots of different organizations that do abuse training really well. And then in terms of creating an environment of trust, if any of you are interested, one of the ways that we can do this, it's a best practice, it's not in the policy, but there are some really good safe ratios for safety. So if you're in a room with infants, you might choose to have 1 adult for every 3 infants. Or if you're in a room with toddlers, you might choose to have 1 adult for every 4 toddlers. These ratios I can send you and I can give you as you're working on your church policies if you want to add those into your church policy. And finally, I just want to say, we talk a lot, the safety task force, I laugh because we talked a lot about pickles, because we hear a lot all the time, like pickles are not exemptions. We get ourselves in a pickle a lot of times when we don't have enough volunteers, and the week before we get a phone call and somebody can't volunteer, and then all of a sudden we're having this panic of, oh no, how do we do this? We don't have enough adults. Does that mean we have to cancel our ministry? And so what we want to really advocate and say, and many of you already know this, like one of the biggest parts of our work, if you are staff in a church, is recruiting, training, supporting, encouraging, and keeping volunteers. And I always just say one of the best ways to ensure that you're safe is to have more than enough adults. Have more than enough adults that are trained and certified that you can call last minute. Have more than enough adults scheduled for an event so that if one or two of them cannot make it, then you're not in a pickle. And so I know that that is hard work, and I'm always here to help think through what that might look like if you're having a hard time getting volunteers in your church. So I would love to talk to you about that if that is one of your concerns. But just a reminder, plan ahead and just have more adults than you think you might need, and that'll keep you from being in a pickle. And so now as we leave, I want to, as we get closer to leaving, again, if you have questions as we go, make sure to put them in the question box because I'm watching for that and then just kind of watching our time as we go forward. So our scenario to consider is this. You have scheduled a weekend retreat. You have 8 girls, 6 boys, and 3 adult leaders, plus you as the event leader. So I'm going to say that again. We're going to do some math here. You have 8 girls, 6 boys, and 4 leaders. You are scheduled to leave at 4 p.m. At 3:30, your male adult says that he can't come. You are left with 3 female leaders and 1 adult leader, 1 male adult leader. Can you still go? That's your math problem. You didn't know you were going to be doing math. So you have 8 girls and 6 boys. You now have 3 leaders, but you only have 1 male leader, and it's an overnight weekend retreat. Can you still go? I'll let you think about that for a minute. If you have questions or if I'm not being clear, let me know, and then go ahead and put your answer in the chat box, and then we'll kind of talk about what next steps might be depending on your answers. So you have 8 girls, 6 boys, and now you have 3 adult leaders. You're going over for an overnight weekend retreat. You only have 2 female leaders and 1 male leader. Wait for a couple more of you to chime in. Some of you, I can't see you all, but I'm picturing you on the other side of the screen, like doing the math and thinking about the numbers. It's not, I promise it's not that complicated. I think that my numbers might confuse things. Aha, somebody asked for additional information. I'll give you additional information. So ages, that's a fantastic question. I don't have that in here. I said girls and boys, so let's just say that they're 12-year-olds, just to meet in the middle somewhere. And do you have access to other trained adults? Sure, you always have access to other trained adults because you've planned ahead. So does that help in changing your answer or helping you answer the question? All right, fantastic. Thank you all for your responses. So before the other questions were asked, the answer was no, you can't technically go, because if you're going to be staying overnight, you need 2 male leaders to stay in that cabin with those male participants. However, with the additional information that you have access to other trained males, you've planned ahead, you can give that another male a call, get them in the van, and then you can go. So that's one of those things that we get in a pickle, and oftentimes I do this because sometimes I find myself literally standing in front of a van, like doing the math, and the math, like, I don't know why my brain has such a hard time with it, but I end up getting like really confused by all the numbers. And so One, that's why we always say have more adults than you think you'll need. Always have somebody in the backup, you know, in the wings. And just know anywhere you go, you need to, if you're going to be staying overnight, you need at least 2 male adults to stay in the male cabin, and you need at least 2 female adults to stay in the female cabin, depending on your ratios. So hopefully that was a fun exercise. And what we do as ministry leaders is we're standing in front of a van trying to make a decision. But it's also important for our volunteers to know as well, so that they're not surprised when we say, wait, we can't leave yet, we need to find another volunteer. Because then they can be your advocates. They can help you. They can be on the phone going, oh, I know so-and-so. When they're trained, they can come along. So it's always good for all of us just to remember that. So I just want to thank you for your participation and your attention as we've moved through this first module. And we've really taken a look at to say, why do we have this? I hope that that's given you some tools to take back to your congregation. And as people might have questions or concerns, you kind of have in your pocket some real reasons why we do this work. And then as you go back to your churches and start reviewing your own church policy, you now have what you need to ask, okay, what do we need to add to our policy? What do we need to change? Or is our policy good as it is? And so I want to answer, we have a few minutes, so I'm going to answer the rest of your questions and see if anybody else has questions they want to add. I've answered the questions about the background checks. So Safe Gatherings is our new system, and you all found that because I believe all of you have finished the training. Somebody asked a question about the fee for Safe Gatherings. That's a great question. This person asks, I'm curious as to how churches might be handling the fee. Excuse me, asking the volunteer to pay the full fee or for the church paying that part. What I would say is every church is kind of doing it differently. When I asked Safe Gatherings about this is setting it up, what they've seen is in the beginning, churches will pay for it, but will let people know what the cost is. And then over time, once everybody gets comfy with the system, over time, they start asking their volunteers to make a donation. Really depends on your church, really depends on your context. I would have a conversation with your staff and maybe your staff parish relationships committee or your lay leadership committee on, you know, how you view volunteer ministry. And if it's, some people really view it as they shouldn't have to pay to volunteer. Others say, you know, it's part of the ministry to make a small donation. So it would just depend on how your church answers that question. What I can say is if in your church you decide to ask volunteers to make that $10 donation and somebody comes to you and says, I can't do that. There's a nifty thing you can do in Safe Gatherings where you can create a coupon code and you just give them that coupon code and they don't have to pay anything. So you kind of have best of both worlds with that option. So hopefully that answers that question. We've talked about what a background check covers, and that's all the questions I have, unless you all have more for me. And so now as I move through, excuse me. Oh, I see a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me get to those. Somebody asked, the conference is paying $25 and the rest is $20. Okay, so let me go over the fee structure. So that's really good. Thank you for that question. The entire Safe Gathering process for every applicant is $35. It's a $20 application fee and $15 for the background check. As an incentive for persons using the system now, the conference is paying $25. And then the rest, the church is asked to pay a portion of the background check. And so the church is asked to pay $10. So the conference is paying $25 and the church is asked to pay $10. Where it gets tricky and where this might change is if you have somebody who's applying for certification that is going to be a driver. Then in their application, they can ask for a driver's check to be run. And that is an additional $14.50, I believe. So that's where you'll see the jump from $10. Actually, I think it's $12.50 because you'll see the jump from $10 to $22.50, I think. So if there's a charge more than $10, it's because they've run a driver's check. hopefully that helps. Let me know if you have follow-up questions. Oh, it's 20. Yes, we pay $22.50. Absolutely. So if you do background check plus driver check, it's $22.50. Perfect. Thank you. And then the last question is, then will the other background check, Red Star, which is what many of us were using, be done away with eventually? That's a great question. We are keeping our contract with Red Star. They've been a great company for us to work with. Unfortunately, they just don't have all that Safe Gatherings offers in terms of a system and tracking and training. So Red Star we will keep for any screening that needs to be done that's not for vulnerable persons. So if your church has somebody who just needs a background check for something, but they're not going to be working with vulnerable persons, or your church does not see the need for them to be trained in Safe Gatherings, then you can use Red Star for those background checks. Also, we're going to continue to use Red Star for employment type checks or finance type checks. So if you're getting a new finance chair and you need to check their credit, or if you're employing a new staff person and you need to check their employment record, we'll still use Red Star for that. But anyone who's going to be working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults are asked now to go through Safe Gatherings. So hopefully that's helpful. So as we prepare to leave, I just want to invite you to think about your next steps. Think about all that you've heard. This is a lot. And I know many of you think about this regularly. So just think about what your next steps are. Maybe it's you're going to go back and you're going to look at your policy and highlight things that maybe you want to change. Or maybe you think, oh gosh, we've had a policy, we just haven't been living into it. So I'm going to schedule a training for my adults where I let them know about Safe Gatherings and I get them into the system. Our next steps always differ. So I really invite you to write one thing down that you're going to do next. And then I just want to remind you that coming up for you all will be Module 2. I think some of you are already signed up. I have Module 2 starting next week, where we'll look at the problem, and that's where we'll do our abuse training, and we'll have conversation about response plans and creating response plans. As always, you can go to riotexas.org/safe trainings to sign up if you haven't done so already, or anytime if you can't make something you've registered for, go on and sign up for another one. That's cool. You can also go to this website for an evaluation of this training. We really do care what you think, and we are testing this now with the hope that we will be able to package it and then train trainers or train facilitators. And so we really do appreciate your feedback. So we invite you to go online and fill that out. And then always anything that you need moving forward is riotexas.org/safe. And if you have questions or if there's other resources you need that aren't there, please call me or email me, because we're adding stuff every day, and often I'm adding stuff that's asked for first. So feel free to reach out to me. And then finally, I just want to leave you with this blessing. And if you are somewhere where you can read this aloud or read it silently, I invite you to join me in this baptismal blessing that we offer together. With God's help, we will proclaim the good news and live according to the example of Christ. We will surround all persons with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their trust of God and be found faithful in their service to others. We will pray for them, that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that leads to life. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention. I'll see you in Module 2. And until then, if you have questions or feedback, let me know. Have a blessed day, and we will see you soon.